Who would be on the Mount Rushmore of Final Fantasy?
Nope.
I'm gonna limit myself to one character per game because honestly, I could have a Mount Rushmore that looks like this. And I don't want this video to be about Final Fantasy VII's Mount Rushmore. Also, this video will have spoilers. You've been warned. Anyway, let me start with some honorable mentions. The first category of which is the boys. Final Fantasy often makes the protagonist a boring dude with not much going on besides big damage numbers. And sometimes not even that. And there are a bunch of protagonists I easily said no way to. Vaughn being perhaps the easiest, but one did make it onto the mountain. Cecil, however, did not. He has an incredible story arc transforming from waffly Dark Knight to dual role Paladin in what I find a compelling story beat. The problem though is that the story in Final Fantasy IV is more about his failure to prevent catastrophe than his personal ability to thwart evil plots. He's kind of a nothing burger. Not to mention, his characterization is uniquely focused around his romance with Rosa and his need to save her, which, as I alluded to before, leads to him creating bigger problems by prioritizing his relationship over the world. And beyond that, there are more powerful boys out there with more compelling subplots. For example, Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. And I'm sure many of you are surprised not to see Cloud's face in the Mountainous Quartet. Cloud is arguably the best character in terms of combat in Final Fantasy VII, with Omni-Slash dealing an incredible amount of damage. And he also has received newfound attention in FF7 Remake and Rebirth. His story is also far more interesting than what Cecil offers. He was injected with cells from Genova. This turned him into a super soldier, but also caused some unfortunate side effects in his cognition, which I'll talk about later in this video. But ultimately, the story of Final Fantasy VII just doesn't revolve around him. While he definitely impacts the resolution of the narrative, it seems almost incidental. It begs the question, why him? And Final Fantasy VIII Squall brings that same energy. He's hugely powerful, and his Lionheart limit break rivals what Cloud can do in terms of damage, but honestly, Squall's defining characteristic, at least initially, is his wish to get the out of any social situation and just do his own thing. And don't get me wrong, he figures out his shit eventually. But by then, the train has left the station, or rather the missiles have left the silo, and two other characters become the plot's drivers. Zidane in Final Fantasy IX is another high power boy, but his high damage is not nearly as exploitable as his predecessors. And while he does have a big impact on the story, it's just ultimately not about him. And Final Fantasy X's Titus? He's not even real, but he is subscribed to my YouTube channel. A special thank you to Famine and Milky Way, my Yacht Club members, and to all of the other Tantacles who make videos like this possible. The next category that I considered is the magical girls. So many games have this archetype, but there are 5 that caught my attention. The first is Edea, who is certainly iconic. She starts the game as a child who is afraid of fire and then overcomes her trauma to push the party through the mid-game. And then after she gets thrown overboard during a Kraken attack, she returns older and wiser and with a panoply of offensive summons to play with. But once again, the story just isn't about her. As I mentioned before, this is one of those stories where the villains are driving the story boat, and by the way, don't buy a boat, and Edea is just part of the plan to stop them. But that is not the case for our next magical girl, who was honestly very close to making it onto the mountain, Aerith from Final Fantasy VII. And I hope I don't have to mansplain to you about why she should be one of the 4, but I'm going to anyway, because that's kind of how this works. Aerith is a descendant of the Cetra, a people of Gaia who were capable of communicating with the planet and its life stream. When the extraterrestrial life form Genova crash landed on the planet 2,000 years prior to the present day, oh shit, it's Jesus, it infected the Cetra with a virus and nearly wiped them out. The remaining Cetra, however, sealed Genova in the northern crater. Fast forward to the present day, and we have Aerith, the Cetra's last surviving member. And like her ancestors, she can communicate with the life stream. Unfortunately, though, Aerith has a huge weakness in the story: her love of pool parties. You know what I'm saying. But even while swimming, her consciousness is still capable of mobilizing the power of the holy materia to, well, you know the rest. Despite only being in the party for half the game, Aerith's presence is felt throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy VII. And she is ultimately the one who saves the world. But here's the thing. In terms of her gameplay, she actually is kind of lame. I mean, listen, if you like pure healers and support characters, she's fine. She's fine. But if you put her in the party alone, she's gonna have a bad time. And there's someone else in Final Fantasy VII who just feels more iconic, more special. Final Fantasy VIII's Rinoa almost made it onto this list. As a sorceress, she's extremely powerful in the lore of Final Fantasy VIII. Her actual power level in battle is similarly stellar, but I couldn't put her on the mountain because of the animal cruelty allegations that have been levied against her. Once those are resolved, we'll reconsider. Final Fantasy IX has 2 magical girls, but I think only one of them is truly an honorable mention. And it's not Eiko. She definitely contributes to story progression in a meaningful way, but but Garnet is far more impactful. Her summons stolen by her mother, whom we'll talk about later, are the entire source of conflict in the first half of the game. And furthermore, her journey to self-discovery and navigation through the trauma of the death of her mother are also important story drivers. But her power level leaves something to be desired, and having 2 summoners in the game just makes her feel a bit redundant. And there's one more magical girl that we need to talk about, but I'll come back to her later. I do want to talk about 2 more girls who aren't really magical girls, but are pretty iconic. Tifa is another one that honestly could have gone on the mountain to make an FF7 Mount Rushmore. While she ultimately is just a normal girl with very large hands, her presence is pivotal to the game's narrative. Many of the actions Cloud takes are to impress her, save her, or appease her curiosity about why the f he's lying about being a Nibelheim when he clearly wasn't. And when Cloud isn't in the party, she's actually allowed to shine. She has to break out of a gas chamber using only her feet to unlock her shackles, and she has the most iconic slap fight in Final Fantasy history against Scarlet. But of course, she's not the primary driver of Final Fantasy VII's plot, and there's someone else who completely overshadows her. Final Fantasy X similarly has Riku, who in terms of combat is the best character in the game. And while power does matter, this again is an instance of narrative importance taking precedence over gameplay prowess, because there's someone more important than Riku in every way who actually drives everything forward and is in fact her motivation. I'll come back to that, because there's one more category of honorable mention that I need to address: villains. The villains in Final Fantasy are sometimes more iconic than the party members, particularly in games with an ensemble cast. And because they're meant to be overcome with extreme difficulty, they're often given extreme power. And the first example is Golbez from Final Fantasy IV. He kind of epitomizes this concept. The player characters in Final Fantasy IV embody the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. But Golbez all by himself is an incredibly evil motherfucker with a huge power level and an incredible backstory. And he might have made the list if he wasn't being possessed for almost the entirety of Final Fantasy IV, or if he had any media presence outside of the game. He's just not quite iconic enough to grace the wall. And Final Fantasy IX also has 2 villains that almost fit the bill. Queen Braun for starters. There's no one else like her, she has massive narrative significance, and she's easy to hate. Also, her redemption arc happening at the moment of her death is humanizing and beautiful, but ultimately she's not even the most iconic villain in the game. That honor goes to Kuja, whom you also get to fight and who has an extremely high power level. He also interacts well with the combat mechanics of the game when he goes into trance, heightening his own storyline, power level, and the overall narrative. But Kuja's influence largely stops outside of this game, and he really isn't seen outside of the Final Fantasy series as a whole, which is not the case for another villain, one who actually made it onto the mountain. Because the first character on Final Fantasy's Mount Rushmore is Final Fantasy VII's Sephiroth. Everything in Final Fantasy VII revolves around him. He's at first enigmatic and seemingly misunderstood, and then as his backstory is elaborated, the player gets to watch his hurt, his confusion, his trauma transform into rage. He burns down the town of Nibelheim, he kills Shinra's president, he uses Genova cells embedded inside of Cloud to manipulate him, resulting in his acquisition of the black materia, and by utilizing the planet's own Mako energy, he summons an enormous meteor to destroy the world he truly hates. And when you play as Sephiroth, you get to see his massive power as he single-handedly takes down dragon enemies that later your party has a ton of difficulty with. And outside of the franchise himself, he's found a place in Super Smash Bros., cementing himself as an icon in his own right. One character from Final Fantasy VII had to go on the mountain considering its broad cultural impact, and he has to be the one. He's iconic, he's godly, and he's everywhere. And he's not even the easiest one to carve space for. Someone who was not quite as easy to justify and will probably be a controversial pick though is Final Fantasy VIII's Edea. And you might wonder why I have 2 villains on this list. But if you've played Final Fantasy VIII, you know that Edea is not really a villain. Starting from the beginning, as a young adult, Edea runs an orphanage on the southern part of the Centric continent. There, she acts as the matron of 6 abandoned children. 5 of them are protagonists of Final Fantasy VIII, and one of them, Cypher, is ultimately an antagonist. But complicating the situation is the fact that Edea is a sorceress, a woman who has inherited a portion of the power of Hein, the creator of the world of Final Fantasy VIII. And because Edea is a sorceress, she is both hugely powerful and hugely vulnerable, specifically to possession by another sorceress from the future, Ultimisia. And in their adulthood, this is how the main battle party first encounters her. She is simply a vessel. Okay, to be fair, a very powerful and very dangerous vessel, but a vessel nonetheless for sorceress Ultimisia. Now, just to give you an idea of how remarkable Edea is, she literally kills the president of Galbadia, and the crowd watching is of course devastated devastated by the loss of their fearless leader, except no, they're not. They cheer that bitch President Delling, and that crowd isn't cheering for Ultimecia. They're cheering for this bad bitch. But after the party defeats her, Edea's powers, along with her possession by Ultimecia, are transferred to Rinoa. And once that happens, we finally see Edea for who she truly is. A gentle soul who, in fact, was a huge part of the creation of Seed, a mercenary group that was literally created to kill sorceresses. In other words, her. She drove the plot forward from the very beginning and planned her own demise for the betterment of everyone. And looking at the most memorable cutscenes from this game, many of the most iconic segments are focused on Edea. And even once Edea is no longer a sorceress, for example, in the time compression portion of the game, her image, her back sprite specifically, is used archetypally to signal the presence of a sorceress. But there's one more thing that happens that catapults her out of just a good character territory and onto immortalization. After the party defeats Ultimecia, the big bad of Final Fantasy VIII, who also happens to be a sorceress, they are transported back in time to the orphanage. And there and then, in an act of love and mercy, Edea absorbs the dying Ultimecia's powers, finally allowing her to rest in peace. Final Fantasy VIII gets a lot of flack for being just a love story. But if you just use your eyes and shift them away from Squall and Rinoa, you will see that Edea is the most pivotal character in the game. And speaking of pivotal characters, the next man in the mountain is Final Fantasy XVI's Clive. And some of you who are familiar with my channel and my opinions may be wondering, what? Doesn't this guy intensely dislike Final Fantasy XVI? Well, to that I say, just because your game is garbage doesn't mean everything about it is. And also, I think Final Fantasy XVI is just okay. And the reason that it isn't literally in the garbage bin is literally just Clive. Because Square Enix very smartly built Clive to be incredibly compelling. And in his role as big fiery gorilla boy, he is the only one in this game who really does anything. The villains, he kills them. The distressed citizens, he saves them. His annoying brother, he incinerates him. He begins the game in his youth as essentially an underage bodyguard for his even younger brother, and he utterly fails at his job because he accidentally transforms into Ifrit and tears his brother apart. If that's ever happened to you, let me know in the comments. He's arguably the most compelling figurehead of the series, and for better or for worse, in my opinion for worse, he is the new face of Final Fantasy. Even more memorable though is his voice.
I am a shield of Rosaria, and I will do my duty.
Consider this channel to be a Ben Starr appreciation channel from now on, because damn, Ben Starr brought an emotional depth to a character who, in many games, would be an apathetic pile of whatever. Ben Starr, and Clive along with him, has been catapulted to a level of stardom Final Fantasy hasn't seen and probably won't see again for a long time. And before I talk about the final character on the mountain, I need to discuss the elephant in the room, Cid. If I had a way to put Final Fantasy's most memorable recurring character on the mountain, he would be there. He has so many memorable iterations. The abusive principal from Final Fantasy VIII, and the guy who gives you a boat in Final Fantasy IX, and by the way, don't buy a boat. But anyway, this is all just to say I didn't forget about him. He just didn't have one particular manifestation that was truly exceptional. There's one more character to carve into the Rock of Faces, and she's without a doubt my easiest pick. Final Fantasy X's Yuna. Final Fantasy X is arguably Final Fantasy's greatest success. It features a main cast of 7 characters, and ultimately they have very few differences between them in terms of combat. One way the characters differ from each other is their overdrives, huge power spike attacks that required charging and replaced limit breaks and trance from Final Fantasy VII to IX. But Yuna has something else. She's the only character with the ability to summon. And summons are Final Fantasy X's most broken tool. They can deal a ton of damage, and they replace the party in battle, acting as damage sponges for one-time nukes from enemies. But those abilities are not what got Yuna onto the mountain. Well, at least not alone, because Yuna is the most compelling character Final Fantasy has ever created. She starts Final Fantasy X with the wish to follow in her father's footsteps and use her summoning powers to defeat Sin, a giant monster that is terrorizing the entirety of her homeworld Spira. So she trudges down the long road toward the final summoning, the only known power strong enough to defeat Sin, which coincidentally will kill her upon its use. From the beginning, Yuna knows that using the final summoning to defeat Sin will only temporarily disable it rather than destroy it. At the cost of her life, sure, but she was willing to bear that burden. But also at the cost of the life of one of her friends who has to become the final summoning. And this, the strength of her bonds with her friends, prompts her to disrupt the status quo, confront a powerful and corrupt world religion's tyrannical practices, and annihilate the flying danger blob once and for all. And if you think that that doesn't make Yuna deserving of a spot on Final Fantasy's Mount Rushmore, well then you should watch one of my other videos about Final Fantasy. Right there. Hey! Bye.